Good, I guess it's Monday. Happy Monday to all of you. The days sure seem to blend together when you don't have as much opportunity to get out and do different things, but it's Monday, so happy Monday. I'm Dr. Sharon Milgram, and I am the director of the NIH Office of Intramural Training and Education. And I am broadcasting today from my home, which is in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just on the edge of Washington, D.C. I often start these workshops by showing a picture of our dog, Teo, and telling you in advance that Teo can be quite a loud barker. I forgot the picture, but he is sitting here sleeping right by my feet. So if you hear some dog barking, we'll have to take a break for just a moment and I'll run and get him some treats. A couple of things about the webinar and then we'll dive into the material. I uploaded a handout. It is the slides and you can download those. In addition, if you have any trouble with that, afterward, someone in my office will be emailing out the slides and a link to a tape. That's the other really important thing, is that we will be taping the webinar and it will be available for you to watch afterward. So if you have audio problems, you can just back out, quit, and re-log in, and it should resolve itself. But if it doesn't, you can watch later. Likewise, if your screen freezes, then you'll go ahead, do the same thing, quit, log out, follow the link back in. I usually have some OITE staff here on with me, but today I don't. So if universally, if my screen freezes and I think I'm moving ahead and I'm not and it's frozen all across, just go ahead and post. But first, try yourself to get out and see if that corrects it. One last thing is we're under some kind of storm warning here. There are tornadoes slightly northeast of here. If the weather takes a huge turn for the messy, it's hard to imagine because it's really beautiful and sunny right this minute. But if the weather takes a turn for the messy and we get disconnected, we'll email everyone later and reschedule. But let's hope that it goes okay. So the topic of the talk today is self-empowerment during your PhD and postdoc training. It could just as easily be called becoming an assertive scientist. And the honest truth is it could just as easily be called becoming an assertive person. Assertiveness and self-advocacy is something that many of us struggle with, both at work and outside of work and throughout periods of our life. This is not a challenge limited specifically to students and postdocs. It's really a part of sort of being human and worrying about what people think about us and worrying about our futures. It's a part of sort of the human process. That said, I think that this is a particular issue for early career scientists as they navigate various training experiences, collaborations, and interactions. And so I thought it was a great topic for this quieter time when we can't be at work and we might have a little bit more bandwidth to think of our career and professional development. So I hope you're all safe and well. The news is such a mix of things to be optimistic about and things to feel really stressed about, and I know it takes a great deal of self-care right now to navigate these crazy and difficult times. So I hope you're all well and that you enjoy a little bit of diving into this topic of self-empowerment. And so when I do this in a room with people, which is really the way I enjoy giving workshops, I start by just asking people to shout out, what does a good day in school, in lab, in your research group feel like? And what I'm going to ask you to do is just say that out loud to yourself at home or jot down what it feels like. What does a good day feel like? And typically people yell out things like, I had great interactions with people in my lab. I got great data. That usually comes out of many people's mouths right at the start. I felt really confident. I was able to get a lot of things on my to-do list checked off. I went to an exciting seminar and got a new idea. There's just all these really positive things that people share. Now, I then switched to this next slide, which is a piece of art by an artist I really love, Yves Klein, and it's entitled Leaping into the Void. And I say the honest truth is we do have those great days, right? But we also have days like this where it really feels like we're just leaping out into a void, where there's just a whole lot of uncertainty. We feel like we're maybe flying through the air without a trampoline underneath us, or flying solo without a whole lot of support or guidance. So sometimes work feels really tight and difficult. And the honest truth is that often work feels tight and difficult. And you know, the nice thing is it's balanced by those amazing times. And as we learn to put those tight and difficult times into perspective, it gives us a chance to access so much more of the positive side of what we enjoy. I think to really address this topic and to think about being assertive, we need to start from a little bit of that leaping into the void place. Because the honest truth is many of us, or maybe all of us, at times worry about these things in our work. We do really competitive work, right? It's hard to get papers published. It's hard to get grants. We're surrounded by really smart people with incredible talents. Yes, we have talents and we're incredibly smart, but we look around, we have this tendency to compare, and we're always a little bit worried about the competition. There's just huge deadlines that we have to work with, and a really competitive nature to our work. We also, many worry about this changing career landscape, and I think this is especially true right now as we sit worrying about the economic fallout of the pandemic, as we sit thinking about all of the slowdowns that are going on for us, and we wonder if career-wise we're going to recover from them. We also have lots of concerns regarding work-life balance. In some ways, I think work-life balance is a misnomer, and maybe what we should say is concerns regarding how we can integrate our work life, our work, and our life, because the idea of balance is a really hard one. It's hard to achieve, and it's generally making good decisions about where we're going to put our energy. But nonetheless, that's a nice, easy phrase for the workshop today. And finally, we worry a lot because there's stress in our workplace relationships, right? Whether that be our relationship with our PI, a difficulty that we have with a collaborator, a disagreement that we have around authorship that really puts stress in our relationship. But conflict is all around us, and most people point out that they have at least one difficult conversation, if not more, every day. And so there's a lot that we have to worry about. And in some ways, you could say that this all comes down to these four really big, heavy questions. Am I good enough? Will I get what I want? Can I have it all? And do I fit in? And that's a lot of worry to carry around. It's also important to acknowledge that worry because unless we address what's on our mind and what we're worried about, we can't actually move ahead. And I like to put this in another context here, which is these pictures, and that is we really do have a lot to keep in mind. So we have to take care of ourselves, and on the left side of the slides are me doing some things where I'm sort of focused on myself. I like to bike a lot, and this is me finishing Bike DC. I spend a lot of time in art museums. So there's us. We have to take care of us. And then we have to take care of us in community. And at the bottom there is sort of my most intimate community, and that's my wife and our son, right? But we have extended family, and it sort of grows and grows from there. And then we have other communities that we're a part of. And here's a picture of me with a group of people that I work out with. You know, I have to say, just looking at the picture, these pictures of large groups of people so close together and engaging is a little bit of an ouch during this time of physical distancing. But those are some pictures in the middle there that represent us in community. And then we have us in work and our work communities, right? And I have a picture of me sort of working alone at my desk. I don't spend a lot of time there. I actually have a stand-up desk, so that means the fact that I'm sitting means I'm really doing nothing about work. And then there I am out with a group of NIH trainees visiting the art museum for a learning exercise during orientation. But we have such a strong identity as scientists and as people in whatever work we do, that really when we think of ourselves, we need to think of ourselves in these various contexts. Us, and our immediate needs and who we are, us in community, and us in our work community. I see a question here. This is self-advocacy for scientists. I think there was a confusion about the title. So you're at the right place, Ali. So I just want to use this pictorial way of sort of pointing out that we have a whole lot to keep in mind. We're juggling a lot. And a part of getting what we need out of this experience and becoming those people reflected in those pictures, or being the people that we want to be, really means that we have to start thinking about setting boundaries, having expectations of ourselves and others, having an ability to discuss those expectations. And much of that comes down to assertiveness and self-advocacy. So I want to start with a very short journaling exercise, and we're actually really going to do this. Normally it's together in the room and we have a chance to talk about it, and that won't happen today, but let's still go ahead and start with this question. Those of you who heard me speak last week in the resilience workshop know that I'm a big fan of using journaling for self-awareness and journaling for leadership development, building resiliency. So we're going to do a little journaling exercise. So I want you to think about this question. In thinking about your graduate school and your postdoc experience, is there something or many somethings holding you back or bothering you enough to be a major distraction? Is there something getting in the way of your success? Is there someone or someones you need to talk with? Something that you need to change? And just write, sort of uninterrupted. Just start putting some words down. Don't worry about the structure or grammar. If you don't have a pen and you're in a private place, just say it out loud. If you can't say it out loud because there's somebody working in the room with you or a baby sleeping close by, just say it in your head. What are some of the things holding you back, getting in your way, people you need to talk with, and things you need to change? And we'll just spend 2 to 3 minutes in this. So it'll be quiet here on the tape for a little while. Great. So go ahead and pause wherever you are. You might want to come back to this. It's interesting. I do this workshop periodically when I travel to visit universities, and I give it occasionally on the NIH campus. And every time I do it, as I wait for the students to journal, I realize that there's something I need to address, or someone I need to talk with. And sometimes afterward, I'll go back and think through this exercise for myself. So I encourage you to take more time with this later, but I think it's just a great lead in to start talking about being more assertive. And I just want to start by pointing out that it's likely that some of the things holding us back are things we need to work on to change about and for ourselves. Right? Sometimes I realize that what's holding me back right now is my ability to manage my time a little bit better, and that there's really something internal about myself that I need to work on. At other times, I've noticed that elements of my communication style are holding me back in some ways at work, and that's something I need to work on to change about myself. But in addition, it's likely that some of the things holding you back are things that you really need to express to others so that you can work together with them to improve a particular situation. Right? Some of this is us working on ourselves in terms of what needs to change, but often it means having hard conversations with others about the situation. And both of them are hard. Changing ourselves is hard, expressing our needs to others are hard, and they're really just hard in different ways. And both of these start with developing our self-awareness skills. We really have to know what we need to change and how we need to change it and what parts of a situation are ours. We need a lot of self-awareness to move forward in this area. Some ways to build self-awareness are journaling, which I briefly introduced, but can be an amazing way to build self-awareness. Learning and practicing mindfulness, which is really working to engage in the moment with your thoughts and feelings without getting too caught up in them. Talking honestly with peers, mentors, family, and friends can really help build self-awareness. The honest truth is sometimes we have a whole lot of secondary agendas in those conversations. As we're talking to mentors, we maybe don't want to go all the way into an issue that's happening for us because we have some element of wanting to look good. And then with family and friends, sometimes when it gets to be a hard conversation, they just want to support us. So while talking honestly with peers and mentors and family and friends can be helpful, sometimes we really need outside party to talk with, and that's where talking with a counselor or a therapist can really be helpful. And these are 4 ways that we can all work to build self-awareness. And self-awareness is the first step. But beyond self-awareness, if we wish to be able to advocate for ourselves and be assertive in expressing our needs, then we need some information. We need to learn material about the topic, and then we need opportunities to practice. And so I'm going to give you some information today, and I hope it'll be helpful. And I want to start by just acknowledging that to some degree, this is hard for all of us. We all struggle at times to voice our wants, our needs, our concerns, our opinions. We all struggle with when to say no and how to say no. And sometimes we struggle to hear and respond appropriately to feedback we receive. And when you acknowledge that, the second piece that comes with that is even beyond this struggle, it's complicated by the fact that we all have different communication styles and conflict styles and work styles. Some people are very direct, some people are not very direct. Some people are very introverted and find a long face-to-face meeting, especially if it's a charged meeting, very draining. Some people are extroverted and they think out loud and they say things that they wish they could have pulled back. So communication styles get in the way. And then on top of that, when there's a significant power differential, it can really complicate our ability to be assertive. And graduate students and postdocs are working in a hierarchical environment. And while I would put out there that you have more power than you might think, the honest truth is that in some ways, your PI and the institution and the organization you work in has a tremendous amount of power over your ability to move forward. And so, if we want to be proactive and assertive, right? So we need to be proactive and assertive if we want to work in this type of environment. Because if not, that significant power differential is going to silence us, and we will essentially not have a say in how things are going. So I want to define assertiveness to get started. Assertiveness is the ability to express your feelings and assert your right and needs while respecting the feelings, rights, and needs of others. Assertive communication is communication that is direct, open, and honest, and it allows you to address situations that concern you. So assertiveness is worrying about yourself and your needs while keeping in mind the other person or parties involved and their needs. And we all have carried along with us messages about assertiveness that we learned from our families and cultures. And when I talk about being assertive, I appreciate that for many of us, that means having a difficult conversation. And so I'm going to sometimes use that language of difficult conversation. And what I'd like you all to spend some time journaling about later is what you learned about assertiveness and difficult conversations from your families and your cultures. And in a moment, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by cultures. We learn things growing up, we take them in, they become a part of what we refer to as our private logic, our view of how we should be in the world. And some of those things were very helpful for us in the past, but they're not as helpful for us in the present. So I want you to think, once you identify some of what you've learned about assertiveness and difficult conversations from your family and cultures, I want you to think about which messages are generally helpful to you now and which are not. Right, so I'll give you one example. I learned from my family that people shouldn't bring up their needs very often. But then once you reached a breaking point and brought your needs up in a really aggressive way, that it was okay. So people could say mean things and say things very loudly and with an element of sort of verbal violence, and that was okay. That was the way we got our needs met. And when I think about it, that message is generally not helpful to me anymore. That doesn't work in the workplace. That doesn't work with my wife and son. That doesn't work out almost anywhere, right? Or maybe I should just say it never works, right? So this was a message I learned that wasn't helpful. Now I learned other really helpful messages, right? And that's what you need to parse out. What did you learn that's helpful? What did you learn that isn't helpful? And when I talk about cultures, I want to talk about how the cultures that we grew up in and lived in and studied in really impact us. And generally, one can look at culture driving the way we view ourselves, and we can group very broadly our culture, our view of self into two main areas. We have what's known as an independent self. People who grew up in a culture driven by the independent self have learned to emphasize being unique, making a clearly defined contribution, being heard, influencing others, getting their needs met. And an example of an independent culture would be the United States, where often the message is focus on your own needs, your own opinions, your goals, getting what you want. And in fact, in the book Clash, which I reference at the bottom, they start out by using the United States as an example of an independent culture. Now, there are cultures that have a more interdependent view of self. And in those cultures, they value and emphasize relationships, adjusting to others, sharing responsibilities, respecting authority. And the primary focus of people who grew up in interdependent cultures is on supporting the group and maintaining tradition and respecting power and hierarchy. And in this book, they draw a distinction between the independent culture that one often experiences in the US with the interdependent culture, which one often experiences in Asian countries. But they go on to point out, and I think this is a really important point to keep in mind, that this is way too broad and generalized, that it depends on where you grew up. It depends on your family. We get messages about self and other from religious institutions that we're a part of. So it's not just this simple view of one or the other. We have the ability to see ourselves as both independent and interdependent. But these are messages that we heard and took in long ago. So when you go back to that prompt, you might realize some things where you got these very independent messages. Speak up, ask for what you need. Don't let them push you around. Or you got many interdependent messages, right? Children are to be seen, not heard. You're here to take care of others. Go ahead and help. It's a really important value to be a helper and supporter. All right, so independent self and interdependent self. And this really has a big impact on communication. So if you think about it, if most of the messages that you've had come from an independent lens or perspective, then you are likely to view your relationship with your boss and other colleagues as more equal and fluid. You're more likely to be willing to be assertive. And your goal in talking with people might be getting work done, getting your needs met, being very clear. And your style of communication would be much more direct. I need this. I would like you to do that. That's for someone who grew up and spent a predominant amount of their time in cultures that have a more independent view of the world. But if you grew up and spent a large amount of time in interdependent cultures, then you might view your relationship with your boss and other colleagues as unequal and fixed. You will see hierarchy as much more rigid and fixed. It will be harder to give your boss feedback on something because you have this view that power difference really means you have to be deferential and respectful. The focus of communication will be on group needs, on harmony, on agreement. A lot of times there's an effort on saving face and preventing embarrassment, especially if it's something about someone in power. And often the style of communication is indirect. Now, there are strengths to both of these approaches. And in fact, each of them has a place, right? And we want to be able to access both our independent self and our interdependent self. We are all a mix. For some of us, the independent self leads, and sometimes we have to tone it down and find that interdependent self. And for others, it's the opposite. And the goal is eventually to be able to appreciate that there are times when our independent self needs to step up. And then there are other times when we need to bring our interdependent self to a situation. For example, in collaborations, if we were all out there putting our elbows out and just looking out for ourselves, there'd be no such thing as a collaboration. And science is about collaboration. So those interdependent values go a long way. So we really want to find a way to bring both of these parts of ourself into the workspace. Now, as we talk about communication, another really important way of talking about it is from the perspective of passive, aggressive, and assertive communication. I'll talk about those three, and then I'll address the one at the bottom of the slide. Passive communication is a very indirect communication style, and it essentially means you accept or allow what happens or what others do without active response or resistance. So you want to use a piece of equipment in your research group, and you go and you start to get ready to use it, and somebody else says, oh no, I wanted to use that now. I need to use it. And you just say, okay. Or you ask your boss if you can leave early, and they say, no, today's not a good day for that, and you say, okay. That's a very passive style. On the other hand is aggressive, and you can think of these as a continuum. So if passive is on one side, aggressive is all the way on the other side. And that's a very direct way of communicating, where you pursue your own aims and interests forcefully and without care about the long-term consequences to the other or to the relationship. You put your elbows out, you say what you need to say, you say it loudly, you say it very, very strongly, and you don't worry about the other person, right? I'm using that machine right now, get away from here. All right, it doesn't quite work without seeing all the body language, but I hope you get it. All right, that's the other extreme. In the middle is assertive communication, which is another direct way of communicating, and that is having or showing a confident and clear approach to meeting your needs. And in the long term, our goal is to be able to find a style that allows us to be appropriately assertive. Sometimes we might choose to be passive. It doesn't matter to us, and we're happy to just let it be. And occasionally we might be in a situation where we need to tone it up and be a bit aggressive to protect ourselves or others. But in general, the style we're looking to use as often as possible is an assertive style. Now, in the long term, if you think about it, there is one other style, and I bring this up because a lot of people will come and talk and say, really, the problem is that somebody tells me one thing, but behind my back, they do something else. And that is known as a passive-aggressive style. And that is where you indirectly pursue one's aims by saying one thing and doing another. So someone says, yeah, we're going to meet on Thursday, come up with a plan, and then we're going to go meet with our PI to talk about it. But they email the PI in advance of that, put their ideas out there, and leave you out of it. That would be an example of a passive-aggressive style. Today, I'm largely going to talk about being or becoming assertive and deciding when to be assertive, although I do think that there's a place for a workshop on difficult conversations and conflict and thinking about dealing with passive-aggressive people. But for today, I'm going to focus on assertiveness. And so I wanted to present those three. Communication styles a little bit differently. And so here in these two circles. So if you think about it, there's what I need and want, and then there's what you need and want. And if I only worry about what you need, then I'm being passive. If I only worry about what I need, that's an aggressive style. And an assertive style is one where we consider both. All right, so we worry about our needs, but we also worry about the needs of others. All right, so that's just a pictorial way of showing the same thing, and I think it sort of helps. Now, when it comes to actually communication, passive, assertive, and aggressive communication, one can look at in this graphic way from what it looks like in general, what our facial expressions are like, our posture, how we're standing in general. And I think it's important to look at this table at some point. A lot of students like to look at this. They often will try, what do I look like, right? When I'm trying to be assertive, am I making eye contact? Am I using firm but polite language? Am I saying I'm sorry so often that I'm diluting the assertive message? And so this is just a nice way with a link to more information for you to think about what you look and sound like, but also to consider others. And I just want to make a comment about this, that we all have a particular way of communicating, and some people's communication style is a little more forceful than others. And so sometimes it feels aggressive to us, but assertive to them. Okay, and so I'll talk about communication styles next week. I'm going to do a workshop on building feedback resilience. I think it's at the same time and place next Monday. And I'll talk a lot about communication styles. But for right now, I just want you to keep in mind that sometimes there's a mismatch between what you think you're experiencing and the other person feels they're experiencing, right? So you might think I'm being very assertive, and somebody might say, well, that's way too passive, or that's way too aggressive. So it's really important to keep in mind that this is both how we perceive ourselves, but also how others perceive us. And the link here is a really positive one. So with that, I want to dive into becoming more assertive in our communication, or at least having the toolkit to be assertive when we wish to be assertive. And I want to start from this slide, which is some of the reasons why I think we're not assertive at times. And one is that we don't believe we have the right to be assertive. And that could be in general or in a specific situation. And if you go back and remember that interdependent lens or view of the world, we get this message from our interdependent cultures and communities that hierarchy is very important, that we're here to respect hierarchy, and that can lead us to believe we don't have the right to be assertive. And then the whole notion of being in a relationship across a very large power dynamic. We might be able to be assertive outside of work or with our friends or with colleagues in our research group, but to be assertive with our PI, that feels too difficult because of that specific power situation. Sometimes we're not assertive because we don't always know what we want or need. Sometimes we're so busy working, that we don't pause to say, what do I want out of this work? Why am I doing this? We're often afraid of displeasing others or of not being liked, right? We are hardwired as humans to connect. We want to be liked, right? I mean, it's so crazy. You post something on Twitter and then you check, did anybody like that, right? Did anybody retweet that? Even something as virtual as Twitter, we're paying attention to, am I liked or not liked? But think in public, with people in our workspace, it's even more amplified. And then one other reason is we lack the skills we need to effectively be assertive. If we grew up in a family that modeled great assertiveness behaviors, we've learned some. If we went and did a formative educational experience in a research group where people modeled excellent assertive behavior, we've learned some skills. But if we haven't seen these skills modeled for us, and we haven't had a chance to practice them, and we haven't had good supportive mentors who've given us feedback, then we may lack the skills. And so I would ask you, which of these do you feel apply to you? And because each of them you'll want to think about a little bit differently, right? If we're focused on not knowing what we want or need, well, maybe we could use some more journaling to figure that out. If we think we don't have the right to be assertive, we really have to stop and pause and ask why that is. Because the first part of taking care of your needs is believing that you have the right to have your needs met, that you have the right to be treated respectfully. That you come, even though you're here to work and you have a boss, that you are here with rights and that those rights should be respected. So you need to think about which ones of these apply to you. And then there's one more journaling exercise for later, and that is to consider a time. I want you to think about some important relationship at work or at home. I leave it up to you whether you want to work at home or do this work around work. I think that for right now, given that we're spending so much time in shared space with people at home, it might be a good time to actually think about that. But you can do it however you want, or do both. And consider a time when you struggled to be assertive and communicate your needs effectively. Focus on almost like you had a camera, right? What exactly happened? What did you say? What did they say? Did you say nothing, right? If you didn't say nothing, how did that make you feel? Focus on what happened, why it happened, how it made you feel, and then maybe spend a little bit of time at the end journaling about anything you wish had gone differently, that you had done differently to calm yourself down, to deal with stress, to stay in the conversation, whatever. And then I want you to focus on a time when you were assertive and you communicated your needs effectively. And the same thing, I want you to focus on what happened, how it made you feel, anything you learned from it, anything you still, even though it went well, you might have done a little bit differently. We learn by self-reflection on what's worked in the past. All right, let me just say that the weather here has changed. It's now dark here and the storm has come in. So if we get disconnected because the internet goes down, I will be in touch to reschedule and finish, but let's hope not. All right, so that's an exercise for later. As we think about being assertive, there's really a couple things to think about, and one is what we want to be assertive about. And that's a wide range of topics with a wide range of importance to us. You know, sometimes we decide to let something go. We don't want to be assertive in the moment. We'll be passive and let that go. And that happens a lot. I get emails from somebody at work that poke a little bit, or a comment made in a meeting that pokes a little bit. And my first inclination is, I want to say something. Let me stand up for myself or what I believe. And then sometimes I think, it's not worth it, right? Because we can't worry about everything. So first, it's do we want to or not want to? And then a big factor to consider is who we want to be assertive with. Eventually, I mean, in life, we're going to be assertive with a range of people, from intimates, the people we have the closest relationships with, friends and acquaintance workers, service workers, and strangers, right? There's a lot of need sometimes to be assertive out in the public space. And then, of course, supervisors and authority figures, right? Which is maybe the hardest one for some of us. Although the honest truth is, because we want to be safe in public, sometimes I think service workers, strangers, is also a hard one to decide about. And then the third factor that we want to consider is why we want to be assertive. And there's really 3 reasons that I can think of that when we think about assertive, and that is to get our needs met, to express a concern. Sometimes we don't really need anything to change. We just want to express a concern about something. And then the one that's most common, to make change in a relationship. So those 3 reasons. So if we want to become assertive, we need to develop skills in 5 areas. We need to develop self-awareness. We need to have a willingness to work hard to change. If these were easy skills, we'd all have developed them by now. These are actually really hard things. We make ourselves very vulnerable to put our needs on the table. And when we're worried within a power and hierarchy, like within our research space, right, that makes it even harder. So we have to have a willingness to take risk, to be vulnerable, to practice, to have it not go well, but try again. So there's a lot about developing our growth mindset about this, realizing that it's a learned skill and we're going to have to work on it. Another thing we need is an understanding of communication styles, right? So we have to understand what our style is. We have to understand the style of the people we engage with and interact with. Then we need some communication tools for being assertive, and that's what we're going to focus on a lot today. And then we need tools for managing stress and for building resilience, because it is very stressful to tell someone who has influence over your future what you need and want, things that need to change and so forth. So this is really a stressful situation, to go to somebody in power and say, I'd like this to change, or I need for you to consider doing this differently. Our stress response leads us to fight, flight, freeze, right? It's a hardwired response. We feel stress, and that leads us into a cascade of physiological events that lead to our fight, flight, freeze response. And to be assertive means to be able to take a deep breath, put that response aside, and move forward. I talked a lot in the resilience workshop about the skills needed to manage stress around assertiveness and around setbacks in research spaces. And we had a workshop on stress management around the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm going to refer you back to those workshops. I'm also going to refer you to some other workshops coming up to deal with the 5th point. I actually think that's the foundation for all the rest. I think if we can manage the stress around this, and we can appreciate that it's a learned skill and that it's going to be built over time, the others fall into place, right? We can develop self-awareness, we can learn about communication styles, we can learn some simple tools, use them, and then add additional more complex ones. But we have to manage that stress. Students say to me all the time, it's my PI, so there's nothing I can do. right? And I like to pause there and point out that not doing anything also comes at a price. So yes, there may be some difficult moments and there may be some real ouches in your relationship if you are assertive, but that there's also a price for not being assertive, right? And never getting your needs met. And I think much of being able to juggle and assess those two things are our stress management and resilience tools. So I talked a little bit about stress already. I wanted to give one last slide on that before we move into some skill building. And I would say the stress comes from two things: our concern around personal safety and our concern around career safety. And I'll have to fix the typos in this slide. I mean, sometimes in the middle, dealing with somebody where anger becomes a part of the equation, it can be very scary. And depending on the communities and cultures and families we spend time in, we all respond to anger in different ways, but many of us respond through that fight, flight, freeze response. And career safety is also a concern, right? We tend to catastrophize and imagine the worst. So if we have a conflict with our PI, we think, oh, they'll never write me a good letter of recommendation, right? That's our catastrophizing mind taking us to the very worst place. So our stress comes from both worries about our personal safety and our career safety. We have to weigh the risks and rewards. The thing is that we have to appreciate that while there are risks, we have to actually appreciate there are also rewards. And I think it's helpful to ask these 4 questions as we're deciding whether to tackle an issue or not. How important is this issue for me? How important is this relationship to me? If this situation is part of a pattern, and if it is, if I choose not to take action, will it have unintended long-term consequences? And then finally, is my fear of taking action fully warranted? And I'm going to come back to this again and again as we go through some examples moving on. And I'm sure in the Q&A at the end, we'll talk about this some as well. But I want to point out in that one about how important is this relationship to me, people will sometimes say, I pull this out sometimes when I'm talking with a trainee or a staff member, or I'm thinking about this for myself. And I think, yes, this is my boss, so the relationship is very, very important to me, so I won't do anything. But then I pause for a moment, or they pause for a moment, and it's like, if this is a really important relationship and it's going to be going on for a long time and I do nothing, that leads to that unintended long-term consequences. Sometimes we can make improvement by dealing with it early, right? But if we let it go, because, oh, this is my boss, they're important to me, I can't upset them. So we let it go and we let it go and we let it go, it becomes so big we can't solve it. So I just want to point out the nuance to asking these questions. And then there's another set of questions that I like people to ask themselves. And one is, so what are the options available to me, right? And I will do this with an example at the end. Like, what are the options, right? What's the best possible outcome? What's the worst possible outcome? And are there some middle outcomes? That's a really nice way of quieting down our catastrophizing mind. We realize, well, there is a best possible outcome. Yes, there's a worst possible outcome, but how likely is that to happen? And suddenly we creatively see middle outcomes. Again, if we can control our stress response around being assertive and having difficult conversations, our creative mind, our creative problem solving just jumps right in and helps us come up with options. And then one last one is, sometimes I say, well, that's a big ask of someone. Could you offer something to balance their concerns? And we'll use these 5 questions towards the end, but my hope is, because we won't get to practice in person altogether, my hope is that maybe you'll get together with some friends of yours, if many of you are watching, or with a program director at your school, and maybe actually practice some of these with this toolkit. Because so much of this creates huge anxiety in trainees, I realized that there's 2 other very important questions. Who can help me prepare? Because this is a learned skill and we have to practice. So who could help you practice? Who could help you prepare? Who could who could help you figure out best case, worst case, middle case outcomes? Who are your go-to mentors? And then one last one, when necessary, who can add to my safety? And sometimes students say to me, I'm just really afraid I'll get kicked out of the lab, or my position will get terminated, and I don't even know if I can tolerate, if I can even risk it, if there's any way to risk having this conversation. And then you need to think about who can add to your safety. And there are institutional leaders everywhere who have access to resources and advice. And I think the higher the stakes are, the more you want to think through who can help you prepare, and if necessary, who can I talk with about sort of the worst case possible outcomes. So that's a general introduction to some of the questions that you'll want to ask. And then what I want to do is go through a couple of skills, and then we're going to wrap this up, and I'll take a lot of questions at the end. I think I have been stopping midway through, and what I'm learning from experience is that it's hard for people who have to get off right on time. So I will stay on and answer questions at the end. So there are going to be 5 strategies for assertive communication that I'm going to talk about. And some of these you might know, we're going to go through them fairly quickly with examples of each. And the first are I statements. This is as opposed to a you statement. And this is where you take responsibility for your feelings, your wants, and your needs, and then you work to express them clearly. And I'm going to give you 3, I'm going to give you a general structure and 3 examples. I feel, when, because, I would like. And you don't have to use all 4 parts, but at the beginning, if you are trying to learn how to use I statements, you can just look at this schematic. And I'm going to give you an example. Your co-author, or maybe it's your PI, you're at home working now during COVID-19 pandemic, and you think, at least let me try to get this paper draft together, right? I can't be working on other things right now, but let me use some of the time wisely and work on a paper. So you really want feedback as quickly as possible. So your co-author or your PI is not responding to you with comments about the paper draft you submitted last week, and they also didn't respond to an updated draft you emailed earlier this week. So now, you're really starting to worry. You haven't gotten any responses. Maybe they don't like it at all. Who knows what's happening, right? So you want to address that. And here's an I statement. I feel, right? That's the start. And you could say anxious, worried, ignored, frustrated. You get to choose, right? I feel when you don't respond to my emails because I'm trying hard to make progress on the paper and I really need your input, right? So there, you expressed what's going on for you. And then you have a need. So you could use I wonder or I would like. I sometimes use I wonder because it feels a little softer. And so across a power hierarchy, sometimes that feels more comfortable than I would like, right? You could also say I would appreciate, right? Whatever words feel comfortable to you. I would appreciate if you could give me a sense of when I can expect to hear from you once I send you a draft by email. And maybe they're going to say, right now, things are crazy and it's going to take me up to a week or 2 to respond. And then that gives you a chance to say, well, should I work on the figures or should I move on? Or to just know that you're going to have to wait a week or 2 so you don't have to be worried that they hate it, right? You can just say, they're not thinking about it, I'll move on to something else. That's an example of really good use of an I statement. Now, every workshop I do, and I've done now 4 or 5 for trainees since we started the self-quarantine here in DC, people bring up that some PI's expectations during the self-quarantine are unrealistic. All right, so I thought I would make an example from that. So here's an I statement there. When you send such a long list of projects for me to work on each Monday morning, I feel overwhelmed and concerned because I want to make progress and contribute even under these difficult circumstances. I would like to talk with you about priorities and a reasonable work plan given the current circumstances and my telework capabilities. And maybe you're going to get back, well, what's the problem with teleworking? Oh, well, I have really lousy internet and I have 4 roommates and we're all on there, or I have to take care of my kid, I have this going on or that going on. But it's an opening to talk about what's happening, right? So an I statement around that. And a third one, someone in your research group has been using microaggressions that make you or you feel others might feel unwelcome or upset. And I was thinking about this one a lot as I was putting the workshop together, because on Saturday I participated in a workshop around hate crimes associated with the pandemic, directed against people from the Asian community. And it really made me appreciate that all of us are going to need to be good bystanders and step up. And that's true around microaggressions, around people of color, around women in research environments. I hear about these a lot in my work. And so I thought I'd give an example from that. So I feel hurt, angry, again, put in your word, unwelcome, disrespected when you make comments about women in science or make jokes about where the coronavirus came from. I would like for you to stop making these comments. Very calm, assertive communication. And if it's about others, you want to be an ally. The microaggression doesn't impact you directly, but you want to be a good ally. I imagine that some of our colleagues feel hurt, angry, disrespected. So these are some examples of I statements. That's the first strategy for assertive communication. The second strategy is empathic listening. And that's periodically summarizing what we think the other person thinks, feels, means, and needs. It doesn't mean we agree. I think what happens is we get nervous, so we immediately agree. What we want to do is summarize to show that we're hear their concerns, but we don't necessarily, if we don't agree, we don't want to agree. So here's an example. Someone in your lab is pressuring you to give up the cell culture hood you signed up 4 weeks in advance. It's your time, right? And they sort of aggressively start telling you that they have a grant due and they really need to use it. And right, you signed up and you too have plans for your day. So empathic listening, you could use a phrase like, I hear you saying, or if I understand you correctly, right? You're worried about getting your paper published before your grant is due, and you want to let me use the cell culture hood every day at 10. Now, sometimes empathic listening, the reason it's so powerful is sometimes it really can de-escalate things. People hear their request and they're like, yes, that's what I said, right? Just conveying the message clearly, when they realize that, it can decrease the tension around the conversation. And then maybe they might even realize, well, maybe I don't need it every day at 10. Or maybe you might feel comfortable saying, well, I could do that today, but tomorrow I really need it at 10. Can we work this out, right? Can we compromise on this? So empathic listening is summarizing out loud what they heard, but making sure that you leave out any of the snarky or rude parts of, if they happen to be snarky or rude. Okay, it's you calmly stating what they were expressing. So that's empathic listening. The next two strategies are called fogging and stuck record, and they sort of go together. Fogging is calmly responding with a minimal response, focusing on any truth in the statement without becoming defensive or argumentative. Generally, you don't need to use fogging unless things aren't going well. If you make a request assertively and you get a response back that's reasonable and that meets at least part of your needs and you feel you can move on, you never have to go to fogging. You can just thank the person and go on. But sometimes you get involved in a negotiation or difficult conversation back and forth. Being assertive often means going from making a request into having a negotiation. So we really need communication skills around that back and forth. So fogging is not getting caught in the defensive or argumentative elements and just calmly responding. And stuck record goes along with it, and that is repeating what you want time and time again. You don't raise your voice, you don't become angry, you don't become irritated, you don't get caught in side issues, you stay focused on what you want. And I picked an example that comes from many situations that I've worked with trainees. Actually, all of these examples, I should say, come from things that I've heard from the trainees at NIH and other places. But this one really resonates for me, and it resonates for me in general because of how important vacation is, how disrespected vacation is in the research community, and it really resonates for me now because I think if we're going to stay optimistic and focused on the future during this pandemic, we're going to have to take breaks and take care of ourselves. So we're going to have lots of mini vacations in the house, lots of staycations. And you know, it's interesting, I was so frazzled by the weekend and I worked a lot on Saturday, and yesterday somehow my wife got me out to the garden and I was pulling weeds, and I can't believe how good I felt after 2 hours of physical activity, being out in the sun, seeing our neighbors walk by, and you know, seeing the dogs trot by. It's just incredible. So we need vacation. So this is around a vacation for a friend's wedding. All right. So your PI is giving you a hard time about taking some time off for a friend's wedding because they have a grant due soon and they want you to finish up a paper or some experiments, whatever. And unfortunately, sometimes these kinds of discussions get heated and intense. So you start out, you know, you asked, they told you how bad a time it was, and you use your empathic listening. I understand you're stressed and want the paper submitted. I do too, right? And that's a really great skill there, right? You did what I like to call build a bridge, or we're in this together, right? You're stressed and you want the paper submitted, so do I. And being at the wedding is important to me, so I'll be away from Wednesday to whatever. But your PI says something that really could escalate things a lot. Science doesn't stop for friendships, and this is a terrible time for you to take off. If you cared, you would get this done, or you take it with you, or you wouldn't do this, whatever. Okay, and sometimes PIs gasp and they say, oh, I would never say that. And I say, I think many of us would never say that, but some of us sometimes in our lacking of emotional intelligence and in our own stress response do say really uncaring things like this. Now you want to use fogging and broken record. So you calmly say, I hear that the paper is a priority for you. That's fogging, right? That's what you said before. That's what you'll keep saying. It's a priority. You understand that. It is for me too. And here you go even one step further. You acknowledge the timing's not great, right? Maybe you wish that you could have got your paper done before the wedding, right? You probably do. You want the paper also. Okay. But then you go on with the broken record. Still, being at this wedding is important to me and I will be away. Now, the goal here isn't to suddenly convince someone, right? Oh, of course, you're right. Go ahead. I'm so sorry. I lost my mind. Although that would be great, right? To get that kind of support and agreement would be great. The goal is to get your need met, which is that you can leave for the wedding and that you can go without worry. Now, some people say, unless they are totally supportive, I won't be able to go and enjoy it. I'll be worried. But there's where that stress management and the resilience comes in. That's where asking yourself, is this really going to be so terrible, right? Does this mean I'm never going to get a letter of recommendation? Does this mean our relationship will be damaged forever, right? The goal is to get your needs met and have as little impact on the relationship as possible. And I appreciate you only have your role in that, right? You have to, you're not responsible for somebody else's behavior, emotions, etc. But you still need to get your needs met. Now, the last strategy for assertive communication is negative inquiry and positive inquiry, and I'm going to demonstrate those two together. One time when we really need to be assertive is around getting feedback around our performance, because a lot of times we get sort of empty feedback or not useful feedback. Oh, that was great, right? Like, which part was great, right? Or we get, that wasn't very good. You really need to work in it. Which part wasn't good? So often we get sort of unhelpful feedback because it's a little bit too vague. And so negative and positive inquiry is an assertiveness tool for feedback. So here you gave a talk and you got the following feedback from a committee member: great job, keep it up, right? And you wonder, what part should you keep up? Was it all great? Was one part better than the other? Were there a bunch of good parts, but one part that you need to work on, right? And sometimes we just say thanks and we walk off and we feel sort of let down and our needs weren't met around getting feedback. So we could use positive inquiry. So I can learn from this and continue to improve. Would you mind if I asked you about some specifics? What did you think about the introduction? And that gives you a chance to ask about maybe what part you were worried about, right? Oh, I thought I didn't answer the questions well. Do you have any thoughts or input or tips on that? So that's positive inquiry, where you're asking about probing deeper to get positive input. The flip side, you give a talk and somebody says, you might not be cut out for graduate school, which is quite an ouch, right? Because that's not helpful and you care. You are in grad school for a reason. And generally, because there's such an ouch in that kind of hard feedback, we walk away, we let it go, we stew in it, it grows, it impacts us. I mean, it can really, really tip us towards feeling quite negative about ourselves and our experience. But if we can hold on and get our needs met in that and learn from it and hold on to a growth mindset, we could go and say, oh, that's really disappointing to hear because grad school is important to me. I'd like to learn from this experience. Would you mind going over the slides with me so we can talk in more detail? The interesting thing is, so students have told me that's impossible, right? And then they've done it anyway, which always proves to me that many students have superpowers, right? Of really doing difficult things. Often when they sit down with their PI from that perspective, then the PI, oh, well, this part was actually pretty good. Or, oh, you know, I gave you that input, so you're right, I might have set this heading towards the wrong direction, but still you could have done this differently. So sometimes not only is it a great learning experience for the student, but if the person on the other end has some self-awareness and calm themselves, sometimes it's a learning experience for them as well. All of these tools and tricks are actually outlined in several of the resources that I gave you already, but this is an excellent book called Your Perfect Right. And I highly recommend it. You can order it on Amazon. And I think that it's an incredible resource. So I'm going to finish up a unit a little bit on one type of assertiveness that we haven't addressed yet, and that is saying no, okay, when people make requests. So this is like a terrible loop, right? I'll feel guilty if I say no, right? Or I'll feel guilty if I make that request. Or it's my boss, so I can't say no, or it's my boss, so I can't make that request. So you either agree and say yes when you don't want to, or you totally ignore your own needs. Then your own needs are not met, and you feel resentful, tired, and used. And if this is the constant cycle of your relationships at work or at home, that resent and tired feeling and feeling of being used just grows and grows and grows. And that's when I feel at work, I sometimes say, you can't let people beat the love of science out of you. But I feel like that's what happens. We never say no. We never make requests. We always ignore our own needs because we think, oh, this is an important person, or this isn't important to get along in lab. We always say yes. We always ignore our own needs. And then one day we feel empty, completely and totally and utterly empty. And this is why, as hard as it is to become assertive, as hard as it is to learn how to say no, this is why we need to, because eventually we feel empty and used and resentful. In terms of deciding whether to say no, here are some great questions for you to ask yourself, right? Will it help me reach an important goal? Will it advance my career? Is there some benefit important to me right now? Sometimes an ask doesn't have a deadline, so you could easily say, I can do this, but I can't do it right now. And I've been doing a lot of that right now. So I have way more requests than I can accommodate right now. And I've said to a lot of people, I'd really like to do that, but now's not the right time. Could we talk about that later? There's some questions here about who it comes from, right? So I do agree that, I mean, when it comes to power and hierarchy, we try to say yes more to people above us, right? Maybe somebody has something important that we need, and so we view it as social capital. I do this for you, and then hopefully you will honor that because I've helped you by helping me. So there are questions that let you tease all those things out. And then there are two really important ones. Will it matter a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? Right? Saying no to being on a committee, saying no to an activity with your peers. Will it really matter a week, a month, a year, etc.? Saying no to your PI about hosting a summer student when in general you have a good relationship and said yes to many things, in all probability it won't matter as much as it seems it does in the moment. So these are some questions that you can use to decide whether to say no. And again, so much of this involves first controlling your fight, flight, freeze response. Because the minute somebody of importance asks us something, our inclination is, I have to say yes. And so a big part of this is that mindful, deep breath in the moment, really deep breath and a pause, right? We need that pause to engage our frontal lobe so that we're not just responding by stress. Here are some nice, effective ways to say no. I'm sorry, I have a lot going on and can't take on anything new right now. I'm sorry, but my current situation makes it impossible for me to do that. Or just a really simple, I'm sorry, but I can't participate in this. Right now, in this time, we all need different things to take care of ourselves. Some of us need one extra Zoom session at the end of the day to talk with people, and some of us need some quiet space, and it's okay to say, I'm sorry, but I can't participate in this. Now, you shouldn't say perhaps another time unless you mean it, right? So don't say another time if you're never going to want to do something, right? So for the longest time, my office went running at lunch, and one person in particular in the group would come and say, would you like to run? And I'd say, oh no, not today. But I really meant, oh no, I don't like to run at noon. I'm not going to stop my day to go running. And I like to run with people separate from work so that it's a non-work activity. And I should have just said, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to do that. So don't say perhaps another time unless you mean it. And then another effective way to say no, if what you really want to say is yes, but, is to say, I'd like to help you learn this, but it's a busy time, or I'd like to help you do this, but it's a busy time. Could we schedule a time to meet and do it later? So I just gave you a model like that. One key thing that often negates our ability to say no is we apologize so much. People see that apology as an in to get us to say yes. And so they just broken record us. Oh, come on, you really want to come. Oh, come on, we really want you to come. Oh, you could do this. Oh, this is really important. And we sometimes invite that by over apologizing. Not always. Sometimes that's just their style. And we then have to broken record them by saying, I'm sorry, but I can't. I'm sorry, but I really can't. I'm sorry, but I can't. All right, so don't over apologize. And so I just wanted to come back to this assertiveness toolkit at the end, right? There are 5 prep questions, right? And then we want to think through when the stakes are very, very high, who can help me prepare? And when necessary, who can add to my safety? And I just want to work through this with a situation that came up just recently for a student. And that is that their PI scheduled a required group meeting for 9 in the morning every Tuesday. And that was okay while the kids were in that period where there was no virtual school, but now there's virtual school, and suddenly the kids' teacher scheduled a meeting for 9 o'clock every Tuesday. And the teacher, of course, is accommodating the whole class, and the teacher just says, I'm sorry, it's the only time available. So I just want to run through those questions. Okay, we're just going to look at those questions. So one is, what are options? So remember, if at first we just freeze and say, oh my God, I have to do what my PI wants, we can never get to this creative problem solving. Here are 5 things that this student came up with as we were talking about things. All right, asking a family member to go to the school meeting instead. They decided they didn't want to do that. And some of us don't have the option for that, right? So that might not be an option for everyone. Just missing the school meeting and hoping it goes okay. Just skipping the group meeting and hoping the PI doesn't get too angry, hoping it's okay. Talking with the PI and asking about another time for group meeting. Talking with the PI and just saying, I'm going to miss group meeting. So that was the 5 things they came up with. There were actually a few more, but I just stopped here in the list. So you notice one was just skipping it, ignoring the PI and hoping it works out okay. And I have to say, of everyone on this list, I think that's sometimes because we're so fearful of the outcome, we think hiding might be our best option. That's almost never the best option. That said, here are some options. And then I was like, well, what do you want? Well, I really want my PI to move the group meeting. I really want to do both. And it was great because we had a good talk about how much they look forward to seeing everyone in group meeting all together, how important that was, but also how important it was to be at the kids' school meeting, right? That this was a really, well, maybe homeschooling was difficult in ways. It was also an opportunity to engage more with their kid around learning. So really, as we talked about it, that was the best possible outcome. The worst possible outcome was missing all of the school meetings because of the group meeting. And then the middle outcome was alternating weeks. Another middle outcome that they came up with was moving group meeting just by 30 minutes, and then they could do a little bit of both of them. And they didn't come up with any other middle outcome. Sometimes there are many, sometimes there's almost none, and that's a truth sometimes. Sometimes it is one person, gets their needs met and the other person lets it go. Sometimes there is no middle outcome. And then they came up with 2 things in preparing to have the conversation if the lab meeting couldn't be moved. One was checking in later if they missed group meeting, and the other was emailing the PI an update in advance. The student also volunteered to take a poll and figure out another time, right, to do all the legwork to make it move. So that was all the preparation in advance. That's how to use the questions, right? What are the options available to me? What is the best possible outcome for me? What is the worst possible outcome for me? Are there middle outcomes I can live with? And are there things I can do to mitigate the concerns and address the needs of the other party? Sometimes all 5 don't apply, but actually most of the time I find that they all apply. I love what's the worst possible outcome for me, because it allows people to put into perspective that sometimes even the worst possible outcome is not that terrible. And even as we sat with, I miss all the school meetings because of group meeting, we had a discussion that there were lots of other opportunities to help. There were other ways to be engaged in the learning. Sometimes worst outcome, when people will ignore the actual situation and say, well, the worst outcome is they get angry that I asked, and then I have trouble in my relationship with my PI. So they take that worst outcome right to, they just are angry that I asked. And I think I'll acknowledge that there's a range of behavior and emotional intelligence and management ability in PIs. And sometimes it is true that simply asking feels like an inconvenience or worse to your PI. But I'll go back and say, or to your spouse, or actually to somebody in your group, I'll go back and say, when we're never assertive for ourselves, it leaves us depleted and empty. And so maybe even the worst possible outcome is worth considering, given that we feel so good when we stand up for ourselves. I cannot tell you how many times a student says to me, I didn't exactly get what I wanted, didn't exactly go how I had hoped, but boy, I feel so good for speaking what was on my mind and doing it calmly and without really getting caught in a big, difficult conversation. And so I just want to encourage you to use this model to work on this as you move along. I'm going to take questions now, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of homework at the end. Here's a question. For my future students and trainees, how would you recommend that I help them develop assertive styles when working together? should I bring up when I just use an assertive style to let them see what that model looks like? So thanks, Carolyn. First of all, the fact that you asked just makes me happy for the future. I always say it's this generation who will change science for the better, and I'm excited to watch you all do that. We can help each other develop our assertiveness skills by going to workshops together. I give students, well, not now, I don't have a lab, but when I did, I used to give students that book. And now I have encouraged people in my office that some people, I tell them to do well with me, you have to be a little bit assertive and you have to be able to come to me, right? And for some people that's hard. So we talk about it, I give them the book, I encourage them to practice with other people first, but also pointing out both when you did well and when they did well. So when somebody makes a clear ask, you can say, thank you for being so clear in your ask. I'm pleased to approve that, right? So you point out when they did well, you point out when you did well. You can also point out when you didn't do so well, right? You can help them learn through your mistakes. So those are some ideas about that. I wonder how I could ask for a personal permission with my advisor in an assertive way. Hopefully that those I statements example, will be helpful. One thing I want to say, and I didn't address it at all here in this workshop, generally we encourage these kinds of communications to be face-to-face, but sometimes when we talk about safety and it's a very volatile PI, we encourage people to send an email and then say, I'd really like to meet and talk about this. Because some volatile PIs or volatile people, not just PIs, right? They'll have that moment of volatility and then they come right back down to baseline and are much more reasonable. And a student pointed that out to me about a collaborator the other day, where they said, I finally learned to not be offended by the first email, that an email with more reasonable approach will come. So if this seems too hard to do face-to-face, you can email and say, hey, I want to let you know I'm going to be away. I always tell people around vacation not to ask, but to tell. I wanted to let you know I will be away. I know that in some work cultures you're supposed to ask, but I think in research environments, it might be more effective to give a soft tell. I wanted to let you know. How to make I statements on microaggressions from a passive aggressive person where the message is quite vague. Yeah, a lot of times that's when we talk about bringing up microaggressions, when we talk about being a bystander and stepping up, sometimes we don't feel that we can say something because we're like, did that really happen? Was that meant to be offensive? Did they realize what they just said? Somebody once taught me just to say, ouch. That didn't land on me very well. And I'm surprised how well that works. That works with equals really well. I also used that once with my boss. And it was interesting. He said, wow, I never quite thought about what that phrase quite meant. We had a really good conversation about it. Again, you have to know your boss, and I happen to know that my boss would have received that very, very well. I've been accused by my grad PI of being overly angry when I felt I was being assertive. This has given me a complex. How can I tell when I'm in the middle of a conversation whether I'm being assertive versus aggressive? Sometimes in this workshop I tell a joke that whenever my wife and I are talking about something, she says, why are we arguing? And I say, we're not arguing, right? I mean, I say that's Philadelphia communication and you have Texas communication. Communication styles really can come into play. There's also a lot of cultural expectations, right? We look at somebody and we map what they look like onto a mental image, right? And so then that can really influence the way we hear things, right? We like women to be softer, right? When we expect more assertive behavior from men. Some students of color that I've worked with share stories about being called an angry Black woman, or an emotional Latina. I think that we have a lot of cultural issues on top of general communication style. I think you want to ask multiple people you trust. I think you want to pay Learn how to pay attention. Are your hands clenched? Are you leaning forward? Does your voice raise? Is your posture calm? I've really tried hard now as I'm entering into a difficult conversation to be more aware of where tension is in my body. And I learned that through yoga, not through a workshop, right? Indirectly, yoga really impacted the way I can sense when I'm tense and not tense. And so you'll want to get feedback from many, many more people, and not just from one person, because sometimes we carry baggage from one set of interactions for a really, really long time. Here's a question about the recording. It will be available. It needs to be closed captioned, and that takes a day or two. Not the closed captioning, that's automatic through artificial intelligence, but unless I say stop, comma, pause, we have to have somebody put in the periods and the commas, so it'll take a day or two. Let's see, I'm really having some trouble with my mouse right now. All right, as an assertive person, how would you best deal with a passive-aggressive person? You know, I actually was speaking this morning to one of the wellness advisors who advises me, and I asked her to help me put together some material for dealing with passive-aggressive people. One of the, I think it's a topic all of its own. One of the strategies that I've tried to use more often myself with varying levels of success is to go back to them using a curiosity approach. Hey, I wonder if when you did this, I interpreted it as that. I wonder if that's correct. And sometimes that just helps point it out. And somebody once said to me, curiosity is your best tool in a difficult conversation. Ask questions. It took me a long time to learn that, but I have to say, as an assertive person, that's been helping me to some degree. And actually, I'm going to read a comment from a program director at a university on the West Coast, a good friend of mine, Diana. She says, thank you for reminding them to contact their program directors to help with self-advocacy. I sometimes wish I had heard about issues way earlier so we could work and problem solve together. You have allies on your campuses. Sometimes you have to really think carefully who they are, right? Sometimes you might have to try a couple of people. One of the reasons why you need multiple mentors is so that you have those people to go with. If a conversation with a PI goes very badly, at what point would you consider exiting the conversation, and how would you do that in an assertive way? So I think that each of us has a different level of tolerance. Some of us can stick with that conversation for a little longer than others, but I generally suggest that people say, it seems like we're both angry right now, or it seems like this isn't the best time to have the conversation right now. Maybe we should meet later. If you feel unsafe, even if your PI says, no, we have to have this conversation now, I mean, safety comes first. And I hope this one never happens, but there are times when I think people do get really angry, and we have to safety first. Now that's where you got to go back to that question of who can help assure my safety. If you're a grad student, you want to talk with your program director and let them know what happened. Maybe you don't want them to get involved. You want to strategize about how you can go back, but you need safety in that situation. If you're a postdoc and there's a good postdoc office resource close by, you'll want to go there. If the department chair or a collaborator, a colleague, you'll want to engage with some other people. But I think it's often very good to say, I can tell you're very upset right now. Maybe we should have this conversation later. It won't always work, but it will work a lot of the time. What do you do if you're a student and your PI consistently rejects your request, then on asking them to meet to address this as a concern, they call you aggressive and demanding? Yeah, and I'm sorry that happened, and it does happen. You know, sometimes I feel like what we really need is a workshop on choosing a mentor at the start, and really so that people don't end up with difficult demanding people. Not to, all bosses can be bad at one time or another. I mean, we all have our less than shining moments, but somebody who consistently refuses to address your concerns and then says you're aggressive and demanding is not really being a quality mentor. And if you are rotating, you shouldn't stay with that person. If you are close to leaving and need to hold on, you'll want to put some requests in writing, decide what the minimum needs you have to get through the situation are, and meet those. But you'll really need to engage with leadership. And then the flip side, I think, is for a moment to ask if you are aggressive and demanding. And I imagine the answer in this case will be no. I'm just trying to get some simple and important needs met. But sometimes we realize our list is long, and then we cull it and we focus on the most important ones. So Cynthia, I think that was probably not satisfying because there is no one right way, but hopefully that's a variety of options to choose from. What's the best way to deal with a supervisor who expects you to pay for work-related things and everyone else in the lab does because they're passive? I'm going to encourage you to make sure you know your institutional policies about this. You really shouldn't have to buy computer programs that you're using for work yourself. There should be site licenses. There should be ways for your PI to support you in that. And while you might be told we won't pay for your parking at the airport, if you're going to present research or you're going as part of your learning, there should be institutional resources to help with that. However, if you can't sort it out that way, another way to deal with that one is to talk to your friends and colleagues in the lab and point out that maybe that passiveness isn't working as well, isn't working well in this regard. Maybe they can watch the workshop and you can all talk about it. I think that you really want to address that. There's a lot of thank yous. You are welcome. How can one go about if it's difficult to understand how your PI is assessing progress? Yeah, so, actually I should have talked a little bit about requesting feedback, and I will talk about that next week in the feedback resilience one. The honest truth is that if you have no idea of what their expectations are of you, it's very hard to meet those expectations. When I lecture PIs, I talk about them making sure to sit and talk to people about expectations, maybe even having a welcome to my lab letter. This is generally how my lab works. But if you don't know that, you need to send them an email and ask for a meeting and say, I really want to be successful here and I really want to do well. And I wonder if you would help me get a better sense of what your expectations are. And I think, well, they might be busy in the moment, so you want to give them time. Let's schedule a time, right? I think that most bosses would be delighted to do that. And if somebody says, oh, I'm too busy, is there a senior person in the lab that you could go to and say, hey, I tried to have this conversation, that didn't work, but can you talk me through a little bit what your general view of that is? This is a great question. Are there any plans of integrating this into grad school curriculums? Thank you, Doris. It's an outstanding question. And actually, having done this now the last 3 weeks for students across the country and realizing, and I did one for postbacks on choosing grad schools and just looking at how much need there is for resources like this, I've been thinking about ways, working through various professional organizations for talking about how to make some of this material more available. I guess hearing from all of you about what's helpful and not helpful in the long term would help me wrap my head around that. I answered this one already. Here's a question about I statements. I find that I'm afraid of saying things that criticize the other person's actions. I worry they'll feel offended or double down on their opinion. I don't have, I mean, a part of this is just hard, right? Melissa says, do you have any tips for facing that fear, right? And I think that's such an honest part of your question there, is that this is especially if we've gotten messages throughout our life that it's really important to be liked and it's really important to accommodate others. And so if the softer we say it, the better. I've seen people in my office or people in my lab give people advice and it didn't go well, it didn't land well, in part because of the delivery. And I've seen when they tone it down and can be softer, that it lands better. And sometimes I've seen it doesn't land well, but it was beautifully delivered. We just have to accept that we're only in control of our part of this. And if it doesn't go well and land well, right, and we handled it well, we hold our head up high and say we did our best in that situation. And Melissa, I would suggest starting with people where it's easier. One of the reasons why I wanted to put off, everybody said you need to do something about boundaries and talking to your PI and setting expectations around telework. And I was like, if it's hard to be assertive under normal situations, this is not a normal situation, and it's even harder to be assertive. And I felt like it's a burden to say, you got to develop all these skills in the middle of a pandemic. So I was hesitating to offer it, but the honest truth is that these are learned skills, and we practice with people where it's easier. Even tell a friend, I'm going to practice being a little more assertive with you, give me some feedback. Practice being assertive in front of the mirror. I looked at pictures and I noticed in my family pictures from when I was little, everyone's hands are clenched. Now I realize when I clench my hands, it's a sign of certain things going on, and those are not positive things going on. So we need awareness, practice, ask friends. We also, one last thing I would say is, if this seems really impossible, I can't stress enough how powerful therapy can be, because if this feels impossible, there are messages that you've received that it's not safe to do this. Those could be in a lab where you had a real tormentor and a really horrific experience. Those can be from other educational experiences, work experiences, home experiences. But we really, if we can't do this, we really need support to do this. We won't be happy in life without this ability. How to balance expectations of my PI and letting them know that I'm trying my best. A great thing would be to ask to have a conversation about expectations, to share what's going on for you right now. Even, I find some students share these workshops with their PIs as an entree to having discussion. A lot of times at NIH, after students come to a workshop, a PI will email me and say, oh, I heard you talked about whatever. Could I see those slides? You could have a discussion. You could started from that perspective. I just had this workshop on being assertive, and I realized I need to talk to you about some things. I'm worried I may not be meeting all of your expectations. I want to let you know what's happening. I am coming to the end here. What is an assertive way to talk with a colleague if they try to take over your assigned job, even when you're working on it? Using an I statement to request a meeting. I have concerns about how our projects are starting to overlap more than I had hoped. I really hope we can be collaborative and work together, and I'd like to talk with you about the situation, something like that. It's really hard without seeing whether it's helpful or not, whether it is. I hope it is. I met with a new colleague to see if we could work together, and I felt belittled during our conversation. I don't know how to get past this, and now I feel like I don't want to work with this person, but maybe I was being overly sensitive. So, Emily once told me, assume good intent and separate intent from impact. And maybe it's their communication style, and maybe your communication styles aren't matched. And maybe something else was happening that day. And so I guess I would go into a second interaction with an open mind, but an awareness of how it made you feel, and maybe pay attention mindfully in the moment to how it goes the second time. If it continues to be an issue and the work is important to you, then sitting down and talking about it might be important. Or you might decide you have so much to learn from them that you're going to put up with it anyway. I have someone who advises me on issues around our website and security, and our styles are so different, and it's so challenging for me, and they're such an expert that I have decided it's worth it. Unfortunately, the questions go on and on. There is a link. I hopefully addressed many of the questions. One of them is, can you let us know about future webinars? And I'm going to talk about feedback resilience next week. And the link to register is right there. Tomorrow, I think, or Wednesday, I can't remember, is Wellness for Scientists. And if you have not taken a wellness workshop, I really encourage you to do it. It's delivered by Michael Sheridan in our office, and she is just an amazing source of information around how to take care of yourself. And there are 2 archived videos, one on resilience and one on wellness, and I included those links as well. I mean, I'm looking at these questions and I'm seeing that there's a lot more that needs to be addressed. A part of me struggles because in this kind of platform, you can't have a lot of discussion, and I think discussion matters a lot. So if you have a program director that you talk to a lot, I would send an email and say, maybe we could all follow up and practice some of these things together. Maybe we could think about ways to extend this learning a little bit, and they can always reach out to me, and I would be happy to talk with them about ideas. It's pretty clear to me that this is an important topic, and it's clear to me that we have to help you develop skills for giving feedback, receiving feedback, being assertive, resolving conflict. And as a community, we haven't focused on this enough. So I will give much more thoughts to all of the input about this and try to come up with some more things to do. Right now is a good time because while we are, I know, also trying to get some work done, we also have a little bit more flexibility. So with that, I'm going to apologize that I did not get through all of the questions. I unfortunately have to be on another call in about 2 minutes. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you all for all you do in science. You know, in the long term, what we're going to learn from this pandemic is that we need more science and clearer science, more science educators and more politicians who understand science. We're just going to see the importance of science in our life. And so you are part of that enterprise, and we thank you all. Please take care of yourselves and stay safe. I'm going to generate the tape now, and you can check back. Same link in just a day or 2, and it will be up there. Be well, everyone. If I didn't answer a question for you that is really pressing and I didn't come near it in another question, just email it to me and I'll do my best at some point to get back to you. Take care, everyone, and thank you.